make a start on our 7th week on the book of Proverbs. And so if you've been faithfully reading through the book, you should be nearing the end of the book if you haven't done so already. So if you've been reading half a chapter a day, you should be almost there. Yes? So we've covered all sorts of topics, and just to recap real quickly, we've talked about money matters in our life group this past week. Last Sunday, we had an interesting discussion about 3 chapters of the Bible, of a sexual nature. So you weren't here, you missed something. You can always watch it online if you like. We've talked about being a good neighbor, planning for the future, speaking and listening skills. We've talked about the value of godly wisdom. So there's been a lot that we've looked at thus far. Now, for this morning, I've discovered in life that there's one activity I really don't enjoy, and it's the activity of waiting. How many enjoy that activity of waiting? I don't see any hands this morning. Nobody really enjoys this activity of waiting. Now, what makes matters worse is when you have to wait for something and then the waiting is longer than expected. I don't know if you've had this encounter with travel. I remember when years ago, when I was youth pastor here, we took a team to Haiti. And on the return journey, we got to the airport on time as we ought to have. And we waited and we waited and we waited. We had gone through security and we were waiting on the other side. And at that time, the Haitian airport didn't have a lot in the waiting area other than seats. And we waited, and it was hot, and we waited. And so we were there in the morning. And by about 6 o'clock p.m., we were still waiting. And flights were coming in and going out this whole time. And our flight just kept being delayed and being delayed and being delayed. Other flights coming in, going out, coming in, going out. And we were just in this holding room for almost at least 12 hours, just waiting in a place where there was no food. We were just there. And I was with some young people who desperately needed food. And I remember that exasperation of when you get to that time spot where they say delayed until, and you get to that until, and then they change it. Have you ever had that moment at the airport and it keeps getting changed? Or then they cancel the flight altogether? Oh, I remember we eventually flew into Miami, and it was like midnight. And we were supposed to be there at like 10 in the morning. And I was like, oh. And to make matters worse, to really tell the whole story, I thought, guys, we need to be at the airport in the next morning. We're supposed to spend the night in Miami. And so I said, you know what we'll do? We'll just push the envelope a little bit, and we'll just be like the least amount of time early that we should be. But I think it's important we get some sleep because everyone's tired. Well, we got to the airport, and because of a storm the night before, our seats were already taken by those on standby. And so we got to the airport. I was the team of, all of us, and there was no seats available. And I remember the exasperation of them. It's going to be a week before we can get you back home. A week? All right. To make matters worse, I'm in Miami with a group of young people for a week. It didn't happen. They got us on the next day. But the point being is that waiting is not an enjoyable experience most of the time. It's not a great time. I think I've waited for packages or for checks in the mail that seem to take forever. Checks in the mail always take a long time to come to you when you know it's coming, right? That seems to be true. Stuck in traffic jams. I've been stuck in traffic around London for hours. And by the time you start moving, you don't know what happened. But suddenly you're moving 2-3 hours later. Those are, in some ways, trivial things of life. But we have much bigger issues of life that we wait for. Maybe it's a loved one to come back to faith, or a healing. Maybe to get pregnant, find that significant other, to receive a promotion or a new job, maybe make a major purchase like a new home. And what happens when our expected time frame comes and goes with no answer or difference? It can be a challenging pill to swallow when life seems to have ongoing delays. It's the big stuff of life that I don't think anyone in our room here is immune to. We've all hit these moments where you think, God, why is this not happening as I thought it would? In Proverbs 13, verse 12, it says this. It says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. I want to read it again. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Hope that is delayed makes the very core of us feel unwell. That feeling of despair deep within, I felt it in my life. Yet the second half of this verse is also very true. When an answer comes, wow, it is the wind in our sails, isn't it? Something that we've really believed for, something we've trusted for. When it finally happens, man, it is so life-giving because it's something we've waited for. Now, this morning, we've got, in this passage of Scripture, we've got two extremes. We've got the deferred, and then we've got the fulfillment. And so this morning, I'm going to borrow a phrase that when you travel the London tube system, the underground system, they have a saying everywhere that says, mind the gap. So there's a gap between the train and the platform. So you hear, mind the gap everywhere. Mind the gap. Well, there's a gap between the hope deferred and the fulfillment. How do we mind the gap in our lives between those things that we're hoping for that don't seem to happen when we expect, and the fulfillment moments when everything seems to come into alignment again? Now, to start with, we need to have the correct source of hope. The correct source of hope. In other words, in what are we really hoping? Because sometimes we put all of our eggs in one basket. We have everything sunk into this thing, this event happening in our lives, and it can be soul-destroying when it doesn't happen. Sometimes the things that we're desiring can take this preeminent place in our hearts. We don't mean for it to, but it does happen because we desire it so much. We hope for it so much. Our hope and our future rests on the fulfillment. And the problem comes when it doesn't happen because we had everything banking upon it happening. And it rocks our world to the core when it doesn't. It makes us sick. It's important to remember much of what we hope for, often in the light of eternity, is temporal. Right? If I think of most of the things I've hoped for and been discouraged when it hasn't happened, in the light of eternity, were temporal things. They weren't things that were, the big, the eternal stuff. It was actually in the light of eternity, this actually probably doesn't matter a whole lot. Maybe it does. But often there are other things that probably are more important. Now, in Isaiah 40, verse 31, and many of you all know this verse off by heart. It says, but those whose hope is in the Lord will what? Renew their strength. They will soar on wings of eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. Now, I want to think about these two passages parallel together. Hope deferred makes the heart grow sick, but hope in the Lord renews the strength. So when you look at that, if we're looking at hope in stuff of this world or the practical things that we're going through, those things deferred, make us sick. There's a sinking feeling when things don't happen when we're hoping them to happen. Yet when we put our hope in the Lord, there is a renewal of strength to go the distance, right? We will run and not grow weary. But that is in the context of endurance. Because life is far less about a microwave experience and far more about running a marathon. It's not a sprint. Life has never been a sprint. I've discovered in my life, life has never been a sprint. I want it to be a sprint. I want it to be a 50-meter sprint or a 25-meter sprint or just let's just get off the starting blocks and be finished. I was never much for athletics at school. And I remember track and field day. How many of you enjoyed track and field day at school? I hated that day. I see a few hands here. I hated that day. And I hated the long distance runs. You know what I mean? The 3,000-meter race. That's not a fun race. There might be some in this room that love long distance running. I'm not one of them. I liked when I was in, I don't know if they still do the 50-meter dash at school for elementary or primary age. That was fun, right? 50 meters, that's not bad. 3,000 meters, that's bad. One time around, 2 times around. How many times around the track do we have to run? Keep going, keep going. I was always the last one to finish. I walked it usually. What's the point of this passage, though? Actually, when our hope is in the Lord, there's a soaring like an eagle. There's a reality that we're not being dictated, and our ups and downs aren't being dictated by circumstance, but our hope is in the one who's able to see us through those moments. Because if our core sense of faith in what we're hoping for is in the Lord, we'll never be disappointed in life. Yeah, we have setbacks, we have things that happen, but the core of your very being is being renewed. It's being strengthened. It's giving you a buoyancy that although this was being prayed for and hoped for and things that we were really kind of pressing in for, okay, things didn't happen as we expected to happen, yet I can walk through that still buoyant because my hope was in the Lord, not in that. My hope was in the Lord. And the Lord never disappoints in His big picture. He never disappoints. Again, that doesn't mean necessarily we get everything we hope for, but it does mean He does know what's best for us, and He will plan everything out according to His time schedule. And so when our hope is in Him, it's okay, because this happens, doesn't happen, but my focus is in the one who never changes. He gives us the grace to deal with the perceived setbacks and delays, remembering that He works all things together for our good. And so even in those moments when you had your hope set upon something and it doesn't happen, you come back to that place of, God, my hope is in You. And so even though this isn't happening, I am trusting that You're going to work all things together for good, because that's who You are. And I can face today with a smile on my face because You haven't changed. Your word is still true, and I can face this moment with strength. Now, first of all, we need to adjust where we're putting our hope, right? Correct the source of the hope. The second thing, though, is calibrating expectations. Leaving outcomes in God's hands can free us from an expectation that aren't realized. Timing is an important thing. And remembering that God has a perfect timetable that may be different to my timetable. In fact, more cases than not, God's timetable is significantly different to your timetable or my timetable. And that's okay, because His timetable is a perfect timetable. And so being able to walk with Him on that journey and saying, actually, I'm going to calibrate my expectation to God. You're the one in charge. And so Your timing, Your will be done in this is okay. And so calibrating that expectation of timing is really important. Often that's the big one, isn't it? The timing. We expect things to happen on our time schedule. And when it doesn't happen on our time schedule, that's when it rocks our world. That's the hope deferred. That's the delay of something happening. That's what makes us really sick, because we expected it on a certain time schedule. And it doesn't happen that way. I think most of us, some point in our lives, have faced that. Some significant moment has happened, come and gone. You think, God, where are You? But if we can understand that God has a perfect timing, and be okay with that being different to our timing, it'll help us weather those moments of life. The second expectation that we need to calibrate is answers. Perhaps God has a different answer to our request, something else in store. Remember the story of Lazarus? Remember that story? Jesus was out doing His stuff, healing the sick and sharing the good news with everyone. And He gets wind from a special messenger that his good friend Lazarus is sick and dying. And Jesus, in great hurry and gumption, says, guys, we need to run to Bethany. We need to get there as fast as we can because he's sick. And if I can get there just in time, I can heal him. Isn't that how the story goes? No, it doesn't happen that way at all. What happens is that he stays there a few more days to the point where Lazarus dies. Jesus then shows up and he has something greater in mind. to Lazarus being healed. It was Lazarus' resurrection. What was the greater miracle, him being healed or him being raised from the dead? Well, being raised from the dead is a pretty big deal. You see, the answer was different to what the request was. And sometimes we ask things of the Lord, but God has a different answer. He has a different plan. He has something different in store. And so our hope is resting on the answer that we expect God to give us, but God can have something different in store. And that expectation of saying, God, this is my request, but I'm okay with you giving a different answer to that request because you're God. And you know what's best for me. You know what's best for my circumstances. So we calibrate our timing, we calibrate the answers, but also we calibrate the process. I've discovered in my life, I'm destination orientated as a person. It's vision of where we're going. It's where the destination is. And so even in driving, I don't know if you've ever been on a trip with your family and it's about the destination. It's not about the journey. The journey is a means to the end. And being married with Donna and going on lots of road trips throughout Europe, and I've been like, we're driving for the next 6 hours, next 8 hours. We're just going to stop for, washing breaks and filling up with the gas. We're going to hammer through this trip so we can get to where we're going. Meanwhile, we're driving through some beautiful parts of the world with all sorts of things that are a once in a lifetime experience to go see and do. And Donna has reminded me over the years, we can enjoy the journey, Tyler. I don't know about any couples or families in this room that have that tension between two people in the car of enjoying the journey or just trying to get to the destination. I see some nods, some smiles. Maybe some conversations have gently happened in the car. We need to stop. We need to stop. God is often concerned about the journey, while we're concerned about the destination. And so we're looking at what we're hoping for, and God is interested in the journey to get there. He's interested in what you're going through along the way. And so if our hope is all in the destination and we're missing that God has something in store through the process of the destination, we discover that God has such a greater picture, a greater revelation. The good that He's working through our lives along the way. We discover that God has something better. And it's not just the destination. The Lord desires to do something bigger than our dreams and our expectations. And sometimes we discover that the biggest answers to prayer are the answering of the prayer along the way. Some of the challenging moments we faced in our life, we just look back and thinking, actually, okay, the answer was amazing, yes. When it finally came, or however that worked out, that was amazing. But actually, some of the things that we encountered, some of the things that God taught us, some of the things that God developed in our lives in that journey of waiting or in that journey of fulfillment, actually, that is more significant than what the outcome was because of what God did in us, because of what God deposited in us, because of what God established through the journey. And so I want to encourage you, if you're hoping for something to happen, if you're believing for something to happen, it isn't wrong to have those hopes and dreams. I'm not saying that. But don't forget there's a journey that God is also interested in. And there can be a blessing in the journey that if we're willing to go with that perspective, God has something great in store for us. Thinking about the answers to questions and calibrating our expectation. Before we came back to Canada, some of you might know this already, but before our sabbatical break, we were in a process of buying a house in England. We had rented for years. It was hard to buy a house. It's hard to buy a house in England. There's a lot of red tape. The banks don't give out mortgages very easy. It's very expensive to buy property. And so we've been saving for years and years and years. And we finally came to a place where we we were able to buy a house. And so we put an offer on a house, a real fix-me-upper. It had a nice location in a village. And this was in March of 2021. Yeah, March 2021. We put an offer in the house. The offer got accepted. Man, we were so excited. The fulfillment of something we'd worked for years to get ourselves into a position to finally buy a house. Been 15 years we've been working at that. And then we got, in the English call it gazumped. The owners sold the house behind the realtor to someone who offered them something directly. And in England, until you actually get keys for your house, anything can happen in that sale. Either party can pull out, can change the deal. It all can go wrong. So that's why it's a nightmare to try to buy a house there. We felt sick, hope deferred. God, what's going on? We thought it was right. That was March. I took a sabbatical break, May, June, and July. We sensed there was some change happening. We didn't know what that was. And so we were praying, God, what is it? And it's in that time period that God started to lay coming back to Canada in our hearts. When we think in retrospect of that hope-deferred moment, discovering that had we bought that house, had that sale gone through as we prayed it would, we would have been in a real pickle, because trying to sell a house is just problematic as trying to buy a house. We would have been stuck in a context with a house that needed a lot of work, in the middle of a project house, trying to sell it, trying to move back to Canada, having all our money sunk into a property. We were free to make a quick decision and move back here. Hindsight, you think, wow, that was God blocking that sale. I want to just say that calibrating our expectation, putting our hope in the Lord, keeping our trust in Him, we can look back in our life in those critical moments and be okay with that, because we see that God was faithful in ways that we didn't see at the time. And so I want to even say that if you've had a setback right now in your life, just keep putting your eyes upon Jesus, because He might have something different He's working out that you don't necessarily see from your vantage point right now. We're moving through time day by day, but God is looking at time from a different vantage point. The last thing I want to mention in minding the gap between the hope deferred and the fulfillment is draw from the life-giving fulfillments we have received. Sometimes we can fall into the trap of always looking to what has not yet been fulfilled in our lives versus looking to what has happened in our lives. I know I have got into the trap of wishing something to be different, hoping for something to be different, but being reminded that God is moving in ways and has moved in ways in my life that when I look and reflect upon those things, I discover that God has been faithful. He has fulfilled things in my life. So a few questions I have just as we kind of bring this to a close is, what has God already done in your life? What have been the big markers in your life? You're thinking, actually, God did that. God moved in this way. You see, that's life-giving when we dwell upon it, isn't it? It's life-giving when you look back at that healing you received. You look back at that provision God, that critical moment, God provided. He made a way. He provided that job. What are the areas you see His fulfillment in? What do you already see Him doing in your life? You see, this can strengthen and encourage during times of waiting. What's interesting about the Israelites is when they left Egypt, the great wait to leave slavery, they went to the promised land. But they were then to celebrate moments of the deliverance, to keep remembering the significant moments of God's faithfulness. Why? Because that was significant then to see them through the challenges they were going to face in possessing their own land. Living in that space, we need to remember and celebrate continually the things that God has already done. That's the value also of testifying, sharing with others those significant things. Remembering and celebrating past breakthroughs feeds our faith and restores our hope. And so again, I think these moments where we feel like giving up hope, I want us to look in a rear view mirror of the times where God has been faithful, because that can spur you on to keep trusting today. Yeah, he was faithful 10 years ago, that tricky situation, and he'll be faithful today in this situation. He is the same God we're trusting then as we're trusting now. Where's your hope being placed? Unless it is in Christ, a sick heart lies ahead. If our hope right now is in anything but Jesus, the thing that we're really pressing into, if it's anything but Jesus, I want to tell you right now, as a heads up, a sick heart lies ahead. But if our hope is rested firmly upon the Lord, you will find strength for the moments when life doesn't go to plan. We're able this morning to leave the outcome in God's hands and that be okay, and it takes the pressure off of us, because how it happens, when it happens, God knows best, and we don't need to worry about it. This morning, we're going to, as a way of reflection and a way of pressing in, we're going to do communion together. Because communion offers us this opportunity to bring it back to the basics all over again. His death and resurrection brings life, it brings hope, it brings His grace, His unmerited favor on our lives. It offers us everything we need. Christ has given us everything we need. And so by coming to that place of surrendering our hopes, surrendering our things that we're believing for, and bringing it back to Jesus and saying, God, I put my trust in you alone. It helps anchor the soul. Right? The Bible says it's our hope in Christ. It brings anchor to it, holds us firm. So this morning we're going to take communion together, and as a way of reflection, a way of recalibrating our hope today. Again, maybe this morning you need a healing. Someone you know needs a healing. Maybe you're looking for provision. You're looking for something to shift in your life. You're waiting for something to happen, to change a circumstance. This morning, as we take communion, we're going to gather around what Jesus has done, and we're going to bring those requests to Him. We're going to bring those hopes to Him. We're going to bring those things to Him, because He's the one who will breathe life into our soul and bring us strength to keep going the distance. And so I want to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul writes this. He wasn't with Jesus on the night He was betrayed. He wasn't part of the 12 disciples. And so what he writes is quite interesting. It says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord imparted this to him. The Lord, on the night He was betrayed, took bread, and when He'd given thanks, He broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, He took the cup, saying, 'This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes.'" What is the significance of proclaiming the Lord's death until He comes? The significance is that at the cross, it was finished. It was finished. And so we come to a place of finality, the place where Christ made all the provision of healing. He made all the provision of restoration. He made all the provision of hope. It's all here. It's all found in this place. And so we proclaim the Lord's death until He comes, because it's in the place, the finished work upon the cross, that we find our wholeness. We find our fullness. We find everything we need. So we proclaim it. We proclaim what He's done. We speak it out. We find our strength in it. And so as the worship team...